The stranger who stumbled onto Rose Martin's land carried nothing but a torn coat and a silence that unsettled her more than his ragged boots did. It was late autumn when she found him, half collapsed against the fence post that marked the edge of her father's old wheat field, his hands raw from what looked like days of walking. Rose had lived alone on that land for 3 years now, ever since her father passed and left her the modest house, the barn, and more debt than a woman her age should have to carry. She was 26, unmarried, and had long stopped listening to the whispers in town about what a shame that was. She had wheat to bring in, and a roof that leaked when it rained hard, and she didn't have time to worry about what people said. The man at the fence didn't ask for much. Water, mostly. A place to sit. When she asked his name, he hesitated just long enough for her to notice, then said, "Jacob." Nothing more. No last name, no explanation of where he'd come from or where he was headed, only that his goods, a wagon, a horse, whatever he'd been carrying, had been lost somewhere on the road 2 days back. He didn't say how. Rose didn't press. She should have sent him on his way. That's what her neighbor, Mrs. Pruitt, told her later that week, scandalized that Rose would let a strange man sleep in her barn even one night, let alone the 5 that followed. But there had been something in the way he thanked her, quiet, almost embarrassed, like gratitude was a thing he wasn't used to giving, that made her trust him before she had any good reason to. By the 2nd week, he was mending her fence without being asked. By the 3rd, he'd fixed the leak in the roof, using scrap wood he found behind the barn, working with a steadiness that told her he'd done labor before, whatever else he was. He never spoke of family, never spoke of money, except to say he had none. And when the Reverend suggested, gently, the way reverends do when they're worried about a woman's reputation, that perhaps a marriage would settle the talk in town, Jacob was the one who looked frightened by the idea, not Rose. "You don't have to," she told him, one evening on the porch, the words coming out steadier than she felt. "I know what people think, a woman keeping a man in her barn who isn't kin, but I won't have you feel obligated on my account." "It isn't obligation," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him twice. "I don't have anything to offer you, Rose. No name worth having, no land, no money. If you married me, you'd be getting the worse end of it." She had laughed, soft and a little sad. "I'm not looking to get anything out of a marriage, Jacob. I'm looking for someone who won't leave when the work gets hard." He hadn't argued after that. They married in the small church 3 weeks later, with Mrs. Pruitt as the only witness who didn't disapprove out loud, and Rose told herself it was practical, a shield against gossip, a second pair of hands for the farm, nothing more. She didn't expect to feel what she felt, watching him work the fields at dawn, watching him laugh, really laugh, unguarded, for the first time when her old dog chased its tail in the yard. She didn't expect to fall for a man with nothing. What she didn't know, what Jacob had no intention of telling her, not yet, maybe not ever, was that the name he'd left off when he introduced himself wasn't an accident. Back home, 3 territories east, men removed their hats when they said it. Bankers wrote letters addressed to it. His family had built half the railroad through the valley and owned more land than the eye could account for in a single ride. Jacob Hawthorne wasn't poor. He'd never been poor a day in his life. But somewhere along the road, after the wagon accident that scattered his goods and separated him from his men, after 2 days of walking with nothing but the clothes on his back, he'd discovered something he hadn't expected to find, what it felt like to be looked at, and helped, without anyone knowing who he was. It had happened before, in smaller ways. A woman in the city once loved him fiercely, right up until she learned his last name, and after that, everything she said seemed to have a second meaning underneath it, a calculation he could never quite trust again. Every friendship, every kindness, every warm word from a stranger, Jacob had learned to wonder if it was meant for him or for Hawthorne. Rose had never once looked at him that way. She looked at him like a man who could fix a fence and nothing more, and there was something in that plainness he hadn't known he was starving for. So when the moment came to tell her, and there had been moments, dozens of them, evenings on the porch where the truth sat right behind his teeth, he found himself swallowing it down instead. Just a little longer, he told himself, just until he was sure. But the territory wasn't as far from his family's reach as he'd hoped, and on a gray Tuesday morning, a rider came up the road toward the farmhouse, dressed sharp, asking for directions to the Hawthorne holdings, and stopping his horse when he caught sight of the man mending fence in the yard. The rider's face went pale. He took off his hat. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said, "we've been looking everywhere for you." Rose, standing in the doorway with flour still on her hands, felt the world tilt sideways beneath her feet. Rose didn't move from the doorway. The flour on her hands had gone cold, and she barely noticed the wind picking up loose strands of hair around her face. She was watching Jacob's back, the way his shoulders had gone rigid, the way he hadn't turned around yet, as if not looking at the rider might undo what had just been said. "Mr. Hawthorne," the rider said again, softer this time, glancing uneasily between Jacob and Rose. "Your uncle's been sick with worry. We traced you as far as the Pruitt crossing. But after that, that's enough, Samuel." Jacob's voice came out low, almost a warning. The rider, Samuel, apparently someone who knew him well enough to recognize him even ragged and sunburned, closed his mouth, though his eyes kept darting toward Rose like he was trying to work out who she was and what she meant to the man he'd been sent to find. Jacob finally turned around. He didn't look at Samuel. He looked at Rose. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her face had already asked the question plainly enough. Is it true? And the answer was written all over his, in the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes, in the way his hand hovered near hers, like he wanted to reach for it, and didn't trust that she'd let him. "Rose," he started. "Don't." Her voice wasn't sharp. It was worse than sharp. It was quiet, careful, like she was holding something together by sheer will. "Don't say my name like that, like you're about to explain something I should have already known. I wanted to tell you." "When?" Now something cracked through the calm. "Before or after I gave you my father's bed, Jacob. Before or after I stood up in that church and told God I'd take you, for better or worse, thinking the worst you had to offer was an empty pocket." Samuel, wisely, said nothing, though he shifted in his saddle like a man who very much wished to be anywhere else. Jacob took a step toward her. "I never lied about who I was as a man. Everything you know about me, that's true. I fixed your fence because I wanted to, not because anyone told me to. I laughed at your dog because it was funny, not because I was performing for you. But you let me believe you had nothing." Her voice shook now, though she fought to keep it steady. "You let this whole town believe it. You let me marry a poor man out of kindness, Jacob, and all this time, you were letting me play the fool." "You were never the fool." His jaw tightened. "You're the only person who's ever looked at me and seen a man, not a name on a deed. Do you understand what that's worth to someone like me? Do you understand what it's like to never know if anyone loves you, or just loves what you can give them?" Rose opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. Something in his words had landed somewhere true, somewhere she didn't want to examine too closely. Not yet, not with Samuel still sitting on his horse in her front yard, like an unwanted witness to the worst morning of her marriage. "I need time," she finally said. "I need you to leave me be for a while, Jacob. I can't think straight with you standing there." He didn't argue. That, at least, hadn't changed. He still knew when to give her room. He nodded once, turned to Samuel, and said something too low for Rose to hear, and the two of them walked toward the barn, leaving her alone in the doorway, with her flower-covered hands, and a marriage that suddenly felt like a stranger's coat she'd been wearing, without knowing it. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the bed they'd shared for the better part of 2 months, staring at the ceiling, running through every small moment since the day she'd found him at the fence post. The way he'd hesitated over his own name, the way he'd flinched, just slightly, whenever anyone in town asked about his people. The way he'd once gone quiet for an entire evening after a peddler passed through mentioning news from 3 territories east. She'd thought it was homesickness. Now she wondered if it had been fear. By morning, word had already reached Mrs. Pruitt, because word always reached Mrs. Pruitt first. She showed up at Rose's door before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, out of breath, her bonnet crooked. "Is it true?" she asked, not even bothering with a greeting. "They're saying in town that your Jacob is one of the Hawthorns, the railroad Hawthorns. Rose, do you understand what that means? That family owns half the territory. Banks answer to them." "I know what it means, Betty." Rose's voice was flat, exhausted. "Well," Mrs. Pruitt looked at her carefully, the scandal in her expression softening into something more like concern. "What are you going to do?" Rose didn't have an answer. She busied her hands with the kettle instead, needing something to do besides think, and it was there, pouring water she didn't really want, into a cup she wouldn't really drink, that the anger finally gave way to something quieter and more painful underneath it. Hurt. Not because he was rich. She didn't care about rich, had never once dreamed of it, wouldn't have known what to do with a fortune if it landed in her lap. She was hurt because for 2 months she'd told him things, real things, about her father's death, about the debt she carried alone, about how frightened she'd been of dying on this land, unmarried and unremembered, and he had let her believe he understood, as a man with nothing, when in truth he had everything, and had simply chosen, every single day, not to say so. Mrs. Pruitt left without further comment, sensing correctly that there was nothing more to say. That afternoon, Rose walked out to the barn, where Jacob had been staying since she'd asked for space, sleeping on the same pile of hay he'd slept on the very first night she'd found him. He looked up when she entered, and there was something in his face, not the wealth, not the name, just tiredness and worry, that reminded her, achingly, of the man she'd married. "Tell me the truth now," she said. "All of it, not what you think I want to hear." So he did. He told her about the wagon accident on the eastern road, how his goods and his men had scattered in the confusion, how he'd walked 2 days with nothing, half out of necessity and half. He admitted this slowly, like it cost him something. Half, because some reckless part of him had wanted to see what would happen if no one knew his name. He told her about the woman in the city, who'd loved him only until she learned who he was, and how something in him had gone quiet and suspicious ever since, waiting always for people's kindness to reveal its price. He told her that finding her at the fence post, and the 2 months that followed, had been the first time in his adult life he'd felt certain someone wanted him, and only him, without calculation. "I should have told you," he said finally. "I know that now. I was a coward, Rose. Not about marrying you. That was the easiest, truest thing I've ever done. I was a coward about the rest, because I was afraid that once you knew, you'd start looking at me the way everyone else does." Rose sat down on an overturned crate across from him, quiet for a long moment. "I don't know how to feel about all this yet," she admitted. "I don't know how to be a rich man's wife, Jacob. I don't know these people, these territories, this whole world you come from. I only know how to be a farmer's daughter who fixes her own roof and counts every coin twice. I don't want you to be anything other than what you are." His voice was quiet, earnest. "I didn't marry Rose Martin because I thought she'd make a fine society wife. I married you because you were the only person who ever loved the parts of me that have nothing to do with money." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of the barn, the same boards he'd fixed with his own 2 hands, thinking, she now understood, of nothing but her. She didn't tell him she forgave him, not yet. But she didn't get up and walk away either, and for now, in the quiet of that barn, that felt like something worth holding on to. 3 days passed before Rose spoke to him again, in anything more than the necessary language of shared chores, passing the salt, asking after the cow, telling him supper was ready. She wasn't punishing him. She was simply turning the truth over in her hands, the way she'd turn over a coin, to check both sides before deciding what it was worth. It was Samuel, of all people, who gave her the peace she hadn't known she needed. He'd stayed on at the edge of the property, waiting for word from Jacob about what came next, and Rose found him one morning sitting by the creek, looking like a man who'd rather be back east than caught in the middle of whatever this was. "He's not what you think," Samuel said, when she sat down near him, more out of loneliness than any real wish for his company. "The Hawthorns I grew up hearing about. Hard men, most of them. My own father worked their land. They'd have had you thrown off this farm the moment they learned your husband's name, and made you feel small for ever having touched him. Jacob's not like that. Jacob gave away a whole season's profit 2 years back to families burned out after a grass fire, and never once let his name get attached to it in the papers. He told his uncle he didn't want thanks for doing what any decent man should do." Rose said nothing, but she was listening. "He spent his whole life being loved for the wrong reasons," Samuel went on, quieter now. "Women who wanted the name, men who wanted the connections. His own father, if I'm honest, mostly wanted an heir who'd keep the railroad running smooth. I've known Jacob 8 years, ma'am, and I've never once seen him look at anybody the way he looks at you. Whatever else he did wrong, that part wasn't a lie." That evening, Rose found Jacob mending the same fence post where she'd first found him, as if some part of him needed to keep returning to that spot, needed reminding of who he'd been in that first hour, before any of this became complicated. "Samuel told me about the fire relief," she said. Jacob looked up, surprised, a little embarrassed. That wasn't meant to be a story people told. "That's rather the point, isn't it?" She sat down on the fence rail, watching him work. "You've spent your whole life giving, without letting anyone trace it back to you, because you didn't trust what they'd do with the knowing. And then you found a woman who loved you without knowing anything at all, and you couldn't bring yourself to end it, because it was the first honest thing you'd ever been given." "That's about the truth of it," he admitted. "I'm still angry," Rose said. "I want you to know that. I don't think that goes away in 3 days, just because Samuel told me a story about a fire. I don't expect it to, but I understand it better than I did." She looked down at her hands, calloused from years of work that had nothing to do with fortune or name. "I think, if I'm honest, some part of me has been afraid this whole time that I wasn't enough for a real life, that I was only fit to be the wife of a poor man, with nothing else offered to him. Finding out you had everything, and chose me anyway, without me knowing to earn it or perform for it, that's harder to sit with than I expected. It means I have to actually believe I was chosen, not just settled for." "You were never settled for, Rose." Jacob set down his tools, came and stood in front of her, careful, like a man approaching something he was afraid to startle. "I have walked through more parlors and dinners than I can count, surrounded by women who knew exactly what to say to a Hawthorne. You never once knew what to say to a Hawthorne, because you never met one. You only ever met me." She let him take her hand, this time. The wedding they held that spring, a second ceremony, this one properly announced, with Jacob's uncle traveling from 3 territories east to attend, visibly moved and a little bewildered to find his nephew's bride wearing a plain blue dress and refusing, politely but firmly, any offer of a fancier one, was smaller than most might have expected of a Hawthorne affair. Rose had insisted on that much, She wanted her father's old church, the one where she'd said her vows the first time not knowing the truth, and she wanted to say them again now knowing all of it, so that this time the promise would be made with open eyes. Mrs. Pruitt cried through the whole thing, though she'd deny it later if asked. They stayed on Rose's land, at first. Jacob's choice, not an obligation she'd asked of him. He said he'd spent enough of his life in houses too large to fill with anything but silence, and he'd rather spend his days in the small farmhouse with the leaking roof he'd already fixed once, and would gladly fix again. He did, eventually, bring some of his fortune to bear, not to change who Rose was, but to ease the debt that had weighed on her for years, to hire hands so the work didn't fall only on her shoulders, to make sure the winters ahead were never again a thing to fear. By the following autumn, there was a child on the way, and Jacob took to walking Rose slowly along the same fence line where they'd first met, her hand in his, talking softly about names. Nothing grand, nothing that would announce a fortune, just names that sounded like home. A year after that, there were 2 small voices in the farmhouse instead of none, and Rose Hawthorne, she'd taken the name eventually, though it had taken her a long while to feel it belonged to her too, would sometimes catch her husband watching their children with an expression she recognized now as something close to disbelief, like a man still astonished that this quiet, ordinary life had been the one thing his fortune could never have bought him on its own. He never did stop mending that fence post, even long after it needed no more mending. Rose never asked him to stop. Some things, she'd learned, weren't about repair at all. They were about remembering exactly where a thing had begun,